Christmas party. Christmas has always been my favourite holiday. Snowy streets, the scent of pine and tangerines, family dinners, all of it creates a cosy atmosphere that's impossible to replace. But that year, I decided to stray from tradition and spend Christmas with my friends. We rented an old country house deep in the woods to throw a festive party. The house was huge, 2 stories tall, with a fireplace in the living room and large windows overlooking snow-covered pines. A swirling snowstorm greeted us as we arrived, adding to the atmosphere. Snowfall, warm lights in the windows, and laughter from my friends made everything feel perfect. The party began joyfully. We decorated the tree, made hot chocolate, and reminisced about funny moments from the past year. But little did I know, that night would turn into something I would never forget. The house had an old storage room we discovered while exploring. It was hidden behind a massive wooden door on the first floor. Inside were shelves full of antique items, candles, dishes, books, and even a few faded photographs. "What a treasure trove," Lisa, my best friend, exclaimed as she examined the shelves. We found a box labelled "Merry Christmas, 1924. Inside were old Christmas decorations, dusty garlands, and a peculiar ornament, a glass ball with a tiny angel figurine inside. "Let's hang it on the tree," suggested Max, one of our friends. We all agreed without giving it much thought. As I hung the ornament, I noticed it shimmered with a strange, cold glow whenever the firelight touched it. Around midnight, I began to feel uneasy. The house seemed colder, even though the fireplace was still burning. Suddenly, the lights flickered and the decorations on the tree began to sway, as if someone had brushed past them. "It's just the wind," Max muttered, trying to reassure us. But the wind couldn't explain what happened next. The glass ball with the angel suddenly fell from the tree and rolled across the floor, even though its hook had been secure. "Maybe it wasn't hung properly," Lisa said, her voice trembling. We picked up the ball and placed it on the mantel above the fireplace. But a sense of unease had already settled over us. When the evening quieted down and everyone went to bed, I was suddenly awakened by a strange sound. It was a whisper, as if someone was speaking right into my ear. "Bring her back! Bring her back!" I sat up abruptly, looking around the room. Everyone was asleep. The whisper had an eerie tone, like it wasn't coming from this world. Summoning my courage, I went downstairs to the fireplace. The glass ball with the angel was glowing faintly. Cracks had appeared on its surface, and soft light was seeping through them. Then I felt it. Someone was watching me. Turning around, I saw a woman's figure in the corner of the room. She was dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her face pale and her eyes filled with sorrow. "Who are you?" I whispered, but there was no response. The figure simply vanished. The next morning, I told my friends what had happened. We decided to go back to the storage room and take another look at the box of Christmas decorations. At the bottom of the box, we found an old letter. It was written in elegant handwriting. "This Christmas was meant to be the happiest, but we lost something precious. If you found this ornament, please return it to the place where it was created. Only then will peace be restored." We were stunned. The letter spoke of returning the ornament to a small house on the edge of the woods. We didn't want to wait and decided to go to the location that night. The snowstorm had grown stronger and the forest was dark and foreboding. After about an hour of searching, we finally found a small wooden house. Inside, the air was cold and still. On the mantel above the fireplace, there were other glass ornaments similar to ours. We placed the angel among them, and suddenly, the room filled with a soft, warm glow. The woman appeared again, but this time her eyes were no longer sorrowful. "Thank you," she whispered, and then faded away like a wisp of smoke. When we returned to our rented house, the atmosphere was entirely different. The cold, the strange noises, and the feeling of unease were all gone. Instead, the house felt warm and welcoming. That Christmas taught us something important. Even the most mysterious events can be part of something greater. And that holiday became not just a time for gifts, but a true miracle we would never forget. Ryan and Tom, two best friends, had long dreamed of a road trip through abandoned suburbs and forests. The journey promised to be exciting: old towns, solitary diners, deserted roads, and beautiful scenery. However, this time, they chose Route 49, known for its bad reputation. Locals avoided it because of constant strange events and accidents, but the guys laughed off the warnings, treating them as just spooky tales. As evening approached, they finally got onto the infamous road. Fog was rolling in fast, and as darkness fell, the two decided to keep going. The sky was covered with heavy clouds, almost blocking out all light, making everything around them seem like endless, thick darkness. Soon, their only guide was the headlights on the empty road. "Feels like we've been driving for hours, and there's still no sign of a town," Tom said, feeling a bit uneasy. "Don't worry, Tom," Ryan tried to reassure him, though he sounded unsure himself. "We'll hit a diner or something soon. Grab a bite and check the map." Another hour passed, then another. They saw no cars, no signs, nothing. They realized they were stuck on this deserted road, and they were running out of gas. Around them, a thick wall of fog closed in, and the air felt heavy, almost like it was pressing down on them. "Maybe we should turn around," Tom suggested, but at that moment, the headlights caught the figure of someone standing on the road. Ryan slammed on the brakes, and the car screeched to a halt. A tall, thin man was standing right in front of them, head bowed. He wore ragged, dusty clothes, as if he was from another time. He was still, standing in the beam of the headlights, not reacting to the stopped car. "Excuse me, do you know where the nearest town is?" Ryan called out, lowering the window, though he felt a chill of inexplicable fear. The man slowly lifted his head. His face was deathly pale, and his eyes glowed faintly, as though drained of all life. He squinted slightly, whispering so quietly they could barely hear. "You're stuck here too, but there's no way out." Ryan and Tom exchanged glances, confused and frightened, but before they could say a word, the strange man vanished into the thick fog, as if he'd never been there. "Did you see that?" Tom whispered, not believing his own eyes. "I think so. Let's get out of here while we can," Ryan stammered, his voice shaking. Ryan started the car and tried to turn around, but something went wrong. The engine made strange noises, then suddenly died. The headlights went out, plunging them into total darkness. The silence around them was so complete it felt like the world had disappeared. "Try again," Tom pleaded, feeling panic rising. Ryan turned the key again, but only heard a dull click in response. Suddenly, footsteps sounded close behind them, slow and measured, getting closer to the car. "Whoever it is, they're still out there," Tom whispered, glancing in the rearview mirror, but he couldn't see anything in the darkness. The footsteps came right up to the car and stopped. Silence returned, but they sensed someone standing just outside the window. A knock on the glass made them both jump. Slowly turning their heads, they saw the pale face of the same man, staring at them with lifeless eyes. "You can't leave," he whispered, barely moving his lips. Tom screamed and instinctively tried to open the door to run, but it wouldn't budge, as if someone was holding it shut from the outside. The knocking started again, now from the other side, and then another knock, and another, surrounding them with the sound of dirty fingers tapping on the glass. Panic took hold of both of them. Ryan, losing control, pounded on the steering wheel, trying desperately to start the car. Suddenly, as if in answer to his pleas, the engine roared to life and the headlights flicked on, illuminating the empty road. The figures had disappeared, as if they'd never been there. "Drive!" Tom shouted, and Ryan hit the gas. He sped down the highway, not looking back, focused only on escaping this nightmare. But soon, the road began to twist and stretch oddly, and the trees seemed to close in. Then they noticed a familiar sight. They were back where they started, at the same spot on the road. "How is this possible?" "We drove straight," Tom shouted, feeling ice-cold fear spreading through his veins. Suddenly behind them, the faint silhouette of a man appeared again, slowly approaching. His face twisted into a dark grin, as if he knew they wouldn't escape. "You're trapped," whispered his voice, echoing closer and closer in their minds. Realizing they were in an inescapable trap, Ryan and Tom tried again to flee, only to find themselves back in the same place, where unseen shadows, fog, and the eerie stranger awaited them. And so, it went on through the night, their cries for help swallowed by the silent emptiness of the forest, while Route 49 led them deeper into an endless nightmare. It was pouring rain, pounding on the roof as if trying to break in. The night was black, with no hint of light. The house was dark and quiet. My wife and kids had been asleep for a long time, and I was sitting in the living room, enjoying the silence, when I suddenly thought I heard something. A faint, barely perceptible knock at the front door. At first, I thought I was imagining it, just the rain. But the knock came again, louder this time, like someone was scratching at the wood outside. My heart froze. I carefully stood up and walked to the hallway, trying not to make a sound. I went to the window and looked out through the rain. 3 figures were standing on the doorstep, dark silhouettes, their faces hidden by the night. They stood motionless, staring straight at the house. And then one of them slowly raised a hand and began to trace their fingers along the glass. The movement was eerie, as if they wanted to make sure I had noticed them. I grabbed my phone, but the screen was black. The signal was gone, leaving us cut off from the outside world. In a panic, I went back to the bedroom, woke my wife, and told her to wake the kids. Whispering, almost silently, I explained that someone was outside. We decided to hide the children in the closet, covering them with blankets, while we returned to the hallway to try to figure out what to do next. But before we could come up with anything, a terrible scraping sound suddenly filled the room, like a knife sliding against the door. One of the intruders began slowly opening the door, having broken the lock with a horrifying, deafening silence. I held my breath, stepping back, but I knew we had no escape. When the door opened, the 3 stepped inside, 2 men and a woman with long, wet hair clinging to her face. Their eyes were dark, as black as the night outside. They silently looked around the living room, and one of them stepped toward me. I tried to say something, but my tongue wouldn't obey. As if cut off from reality, I just stood there, as if hypnotized. The woman with the long hair glided up the stairs leading to the 2nd floor. I realized they were planning to search the whole house, and, as if in a dream, I tried to block her path. But her hand, cold as ice, pushed me aside. She didn't even look at me. Her eyes were focused on nothing, as if I didn't exist. When they started up the stairs, where the children were hidden, I snapped back to reality and, gathering my last bit of strength, screamed. My voice cut through the silence, and the intruders froze. For a moment, something dark and animalistic flickered in their eyes, and I realized that no negotiation would help us. My wife, hearing my scream, grabbed a heavy vase from the sideboard and threw it at one of the intruders. He staggered but immediately lunged at us. I grabbed the first thing I could find, a flashlight, and shined the light straight into his face. His eyes glinted like those of a predator, and he instantly stepped back, covering his face with his hands. The woman in their group hissed angrily, like a snake, and grabbed the man's arm, pulling him back. At that moment, a siren sounded from outside. The alarm had gone off. Without saying a word, the intruders turned and disappeared into the darkness, vanishing into the night. We were left in silence, trembling and holding our children, who had come out of hiding when everything quieted down. That night, we stayed in the house, barely breathing, listening to every sound. Only at dawn did we dare to look outside, but there were no traces of our nighttime visitors. Since then, the kids can't sleep without a light on, and I still feel like I hear faint rustling outside the door at night when the rain beats against the windows. It happened in winter, just before New Year's Eve. Frost had locked the village in ice, and a thick fog rolled over the ground. In a small house near the edge of the forest, an old widow named Martha was celebrating Christmas with her grandsons, 12-year-old Thomas and 8-year-old Edward. Their parents were delayed in the city, so Martha and the boys were left alone for the night. The evening was quiet. They sat by the fireplace, telling stories and baking cookies. When the clock struck midnight, Martha tucked the boys in and prepared to go to bed herself. The house was silent, except for the wind howling outside and the creaking of trees in the frost. But then Martha heard something, the crunch of snow outside the windows, as if someone was walking around the house. She tensed. Sounds like that in winter usually meant only one thing. Someone had come near their home. Approaching the window, she carefully looked outside and saw a dark figure in the fog, standing at the gate. The person was draped in a long coat, holding a strange, knotted staff. Martha couldn't make out their face, but she felt a chill run through her. She tried to convince herself it was just a passerby, but the dark figure didn't move. Instead, it turned its head towards the house and stood still, as if looking into the windows. Martha held her breath and took a step back. Just then, she heard a noise coming from the attic, like heavy footsteps crossing the creaky floorboards. Martha whipped around, but no one was supposed to be in the attic. It had been empty for years. She stood frozen, listening, and heard the noise again. Footsteps coming closer, all the way to the stairs. Realizing something was very wrong, Martha rushed to wake the boys. Whispering, she told them to dress quietly and murmured that they needed to get out of the house before someone came inside. Thomas and Edward, frightened by her expression, nodded silently. But as soon as they began to get dressed, the sound of footsteps shifted to a strange, soft tapping, as if someone were gently knocking on the walls, moving around the house. Then came a sinister scratching sound at the front door. Martha grabbed the boys by their hands and quietly led them to the pantry, where there was an old hidden passage that led out to the forest. They crept in, and Martha urged the boys into the tunnel, telling them to run to the neighbours. But she stayed at the door, afraid the stranger would notice them if he heard any noise. The sound at the door grew louder, as though someone was determined to break the lock. The door creaked, and suddenly it swung open into the cold night. Martha, holding her breath, peeked out from the pantry and saw the dark-coated figure step inside. Now his face was lit by the dim light of the fireplace. He had pale, ghostly features and empty eyes. In his hands, he held an old Christmas wreath woven from dry branches and rusted thorns, and on his fingers were several old rings that Martha recognized. They were worn by the old villagers who had died many years ago. He stopped in the middle of the room, casting his empty gaze around, and for a moment it seemed he caught someone's scent. But just as the figure stepped toward the pantry door, the wind suddenly howled through the house, as if something was stopping him. The stranger froze, glanced around the empty room, and as though hearing an unseen call, silently stepped back out, disappearing into the fog. Martha waited until his footsteps faded into the forest, and only then did she call the boys back. The neighbours later mentioned that over the past few years, they had started to notice strange things in the village, as if old spirits were beginning to return on Christmas Eve. Martha knew that she didn't want to celebrate this holiday alone anymore. Now she realised that the fog and the night could bring not only stray guests, but also those who had long left, yet still remembered their way back. I've been a truck driver for almost 10 years and thought I'd seen it all. Overturned vehicles, strange people you meet on the road at night. But what happened last week made me rethink everything. My partner, Alex, and I were driving down a dark road through thick forest. It was a long, hard haul, but we were used to driving at night. There was no moon or stars in the sky. The road stretched out like a long ribbon of darkness, lit only by our truck's headlights. Alex had dozed off, and I was trying to keep my speed steady to stay on schedule. Around midnight, just as I started feeling tired, I noticed something strange by the side of the road. Up ahead, right at the edge of the highway, stood a girl in a long white dress. She was perfectly still, staring at the road as if waiting for someone. I slowed down, and Alex woke up and saw her too. We exchanged glances, and he suggested we stop to see if she needed help. Seeing someone standing alone out here, far from any town, was strange in itself, so I agreed. I slowed to a stop, and we got out of the truck. The girl stood there, not moving, and as we got closer, I noticed that she didn't seem to see us. Her gaze was fixed far off, and her face looked vacant, like someone who'd long lost themselves. Alex quietly called out to her, but she didn't react. We tried stepping closer, but suddenly she took a step back, right into the darkness, and vanished. We froze. There were no sounds, no trace, just silence. Thinking it was just our imaginations playing tricks, we got back in the truck. I tried to convince myself it was only a mirage, a result of road fatigue. But as we got into the cab and tried to keep going, the engine suddenly died. I checked the gauges, but everything looked fine. The cab was eerily quiet, and there was an unsettling feeling in the air. Alex grabbed a flashlight and got out to check the engine. I stayed in the cab, staring into the darkness, when I heard a faint whisper coming from the woods. It was barely audible, but clear enough to sound like someone calling my name. I felt a chill run through me. I looked around, but there was no one, just the dark wall of trees along the road. Then Alex's flashlight went out. In that same moment, he yelled, jumped back into the cab, and slammed the door. His eyes were wide with fear, and he managed to say only one word: drive. I didn't ask what he saw. I just turned the key, and strangely, the engine started right up. We sped off and drove the rest of the way in silence. Only when we reached a motel at the next gas station did Alex tell me what he'd seen. When he stood by the engine with the flashlight, he noticed that same girl again on the other side of the road. But this time, she was much closer, her face pale and drawn, with eyes that seemed to stare right into him. At that moment, he felt like she wanted to say something, but instead, she simply vanished. We spent the rest of the night in the motel and drove back out onto the road with the first light of dawn. We never saw her again, and everything ended fine. But sometimes, when I'm back on the night road, I still find myself looking to the roadside, and deep down, I hope I'll never see her again.